Hi theory students. Today we'll be talking about binary forms, which is a very important kind of form for pieces and movements of multi-movement pieces from the Baroque and Classical era. A binary form is a work or a movement that's primarily divided into two sections. In the Baroque and Classical eras, it was typical for each of the two sections to be repeated. So, for example, you may have at the end of the first section a repeat sign to go back to the beginning, and the beginning of the second section a repeat sign, so that when you get to the double bar line, you'll go back to this spot and repeat. Here are the important things that we'll be looking at when we look at binary forms. First, we're going to be looking at the cadence at the end of the first section, and that will tell us something very interesting about what kind of binary form it is. We want to look at the thematic use throughout. We want to see what motives are used and if those motives come back in later phrases. And we also want to look at the section right at the phrase right at the beginning of the second section, and that will usually form a contrast to the material that we had in section 1. I'd like you to get your books so that you could follow the examples there to illustrate the things that we're talking about. A sectional binary form is one where the first half ends with an authentic cadence in the home key. While the chapter 23 in the book does not have an example of a sectional binary form, there is one in the anthology, and I'll play you a recording of it. This is a Mozart minuet that he wrote at a very young age. That's the end of the first section, and this is the same place where we started in terms of key. Let's listen to the repeat so you could hear that again. That's the end of the first section, and because the first section ends with an authentic cadence in the home key, F, we call that a sectional binary form. A continuous binary form is one where the first half ends with either a half cadence in the home key or an authentic cadence in another key. Here, look at example 23.1 in your textbook. That's on page 468. Listen now to the first section, which starts in D major, and then at the end of the section modulates to the dominant, A major. Half cadence in D. And then we have an authentic cadence in the key of A, the key of the dominant. So that's a continuous binary form because the section is not completely closed, but it suggests that we need to hear what continues in order to have closure in the home key. Most often in a continuous binary form, a major key piece will go to the dominant, 5, and a minor key piece will go to the relative major, 3. To see a good example of this, look at example 23.3 on page 471. And here we'll hear the first section, which goes from D minor to F major. This is a repeat now. And we'll hear that it goes from D minor to F major, the relative major. So we just talked about what happens in the first section of a binary form, that either we have an authentic cadence in the home key, which makes it a sectional binary, or we have a cadence in a different key, typically in the dominant for major key, and in the relative major if it's a minor key piece. So now what happens in the second section of the form? Usually the phrase that begins the second section forms a contrast with the first section, and this often involves a phrase that either starts or moves to a new key. Look at example 23.2, which is the second section of that Mozart theme that we heard earlier. Here, we hear this on page 469, we hear this as a complete phrase in the key of A major. So there we are in the key of A major. And what happens now is the last phrase will return to the home key. That's a cadence in A. And that's a return to D major. Now what we just heard, in addition to the last phrase being in the home key, the last phrase also used the opening theme. That theme. When the opening theme returns along with the return of the home key, this is called a rounded binary form. If this does not happen, then we call that a simple binary form. So again, rounded means the return of the home key also means the return of the opening motive or theme. Every other variant of that is a simple binary form. To give you an example of a simple binary form, look at the minor key minuet where we just heard the first section. To remind you, the opening theme of that first section goes like this. Now, listen to what happens in the second section of that piece. And that in your book is example 23.4. We're in F major. Now we're back in D. Notice that you didn't hear the opening theme at all, but rather a different theme. We went back to the home key D minor, but we did not get back to D minor with the theme that started the piece in D minor, and that makes it a simple binary form. There's a kind of simple binary form in which the theme at the end of the first section comes back for the home key in the second section. Or to put it another way, imagine that the first section has a theme A and a theme B, And here's the end of the section with the repeat signs. The second section may either have an entirely new theme or may have the first theme but in the key of the dominant. And then we return to the home key, not with the opening theme A, but rather with this theme. If you look at the examples in your book, you will see these demonstrated in 23.5 as we hear the end of the first section of a Scarlatti sonata in G major, in which the end goes to the dominant D, and then we'll hear the exact same theme at the end of the second section as we're in our home key, G major. So listen to these. So there we are in D major, the key of the dominant. Let me play that theme again so you can get it in your ears. And remember, that's the theme not at the beginning of the sonata, but at the end of the first section. Now let's hear this not in D major, but at the end of the second section when we go back to the home key. It's now in G major, our home key, but with the same theme that we heard previously in D. So as I said, we return to the home key not with the opening theme, but with the theme that was heard in our secondary key, the key of the dominant. So to summarize, sectional versus continuous has to do with the cadence at the end of section 1. Rounded versus simple binary has to do with the theme that's used for the phrase in the second section that returns to the home key. Rounded brings back the opening theme to go with the return to the home key. Simple does not. In a simple binary, if instead they use a theme that was at the end of section 1, then we call that balanced. And finally, some techniques about what happens when you start the second section and you're in a different key, and then you have to get back to the home key. Classical practice gave students a handy mnemonic for 3 different ways to do this. And these are not the only ways to do this, but they're very useful. So in Italian, these were called ponte, monte, and fonte, which literally means bridge, mountain, and fountain. I'll give you examples for how this works. The ponte, or bridge, relies on a dominant expansion at the end of that contrasting phrase, and this will take us back to the tonic. So imagine if we're in the key of G, but now we hear a theme something like this. Where we're outlining the dominant chord in the key of G, in other words, a D7 chord. So it sounds like this. And now we're ready to go back to the key of G when the home key returns in the next phrase. Okay, now imagine the second way to do this. And this is a so-called monte, or mountain, because it's a sequence that ascends or climbs. So in a case like this, imagine that the progression is 5-7 of 4 to 4, And now we're going to repeat that progression a step higher, 5, 7 of 5 to 5. That takes us to a half cadence, which prepares the return of the home key in the very next phrase. So now here we get and we're ready to go back. To the key of G. The last example, the fonte or fountain, is so named because the sequence descends or cascades down. 5, 7 to 2 going to 2, and then we repeat that segment a step lower, 5, 7 to 1. Melodically, it may sound like this. So now we have an authentic cadence in G, and then the last phrase confirming G major may begin. Or however the theme might go. There are a lot more things to say about binary forms, but we'll be looking at pieces in class, and that will help you. To review the last things that we talked about, if the contrasting phrase ends with a dominant expansion, that's the so-called ponte or bridge. If it ends with an ascending sequence, and this is a good example, because it climbs, it was called monte or mountain. Or if it ends with a descending sequence, it falls, so it was called fonte or fountain. We'll look at more pieces in class and demonstrate these concepts as we analyze. That's all for today.